that they don't necessarily converge. They're all both nice. It's nice to have mobility. It's nice to have inclusion. But it does not necessarily converge, and that's what's important. How can we make sure, for example, that the language or languages that we use to achieve mobility aren't too overbearing? Because this can undermine the very conditions of inclusion. Because the dominant presence of some languages, which results from mobility, may, and this is unsurprising, cause some identitarian backlash, right? And we sometimes see the results of this at the ballot box. Or it may marginalize local languages. It can result in uniformization, and uniformization endangers diversity. Now, conversely, if we emphasize inclusion, if we prioritize the languages of some communities, because this is necessary in order to provide the context for inclusion, we need this context in order to be able to welcome the other, for the other to be included into. Now, doesn't a prioritization of inclusion, doesn't it risk hampering mobility, hampering fluidity? Now again, let me insist that inclusion is a very complex notion, which is why we'll return to this in a moment. But the first point I really wanted to make here is that there is a trade-off, right? And the problem, not just in Europe, but I think quite generally, is that mobility and inclusion are linked. They're closely tied together, in particular because language intervenes, is a key dimension both of mobility and inclusion. But the problem is that having more of one very often will entail having less of the other. This is the difficulty. This is why it's a challenge. Otherwise, it would not really be a challenge. And otherwise, perhaps there wouldn't even be a need for a meeting like today, right? The problem is, again, that more mobility often means undermining inclusion, but more inclusion often means hampering mobility. And it's a very classical situation. In fact, in policy analysis, it is known as a trade-off. Those of you who may remember economics courses from recently or from long ago may remember how important the notion of trade-off is in all kinds of very fundamental models in economic analysis. So we need to solve, or actually to resolve, the problem of the trade-off. And this requires, first of all, that's only the first step, finding the best balance between the two, between mobility and inclusion. Now, let's remember that both mobility and inclusion are both goods. It's both good things, right? They both offer advantages, but they also both carry costs, including, and one of the costs is precisely that the very fact of having more of one means that we're probably going to have less of the other, because they are not exactly opposing, but at least non-converging. So, when we say that they carry both benefits and costs, I think this is also something that's really important, in particular when we're talking not just among ourselves, not just among people who are already convinced that multilingualism is interesting, it's a good thing, etc. But very often it's not enough to preach to the converted. It's not enough to speak among ourselves who already agree on this. It's important to be able to talk to people who disagree with us. And in fact, it's essential, and much of what I'm going to have to say in the rest of this talk is actually connected with this concern, with the necessity to be able to communicate the importance of multilingualism with people or to people who do not necessarily agree with us. And linguistic diversity is a complex and possibly even ambivalent reality. Linguistic diversity is ultimately intrinsically in itself. It's not always good or bad, right? I think we have to simply recognize that it is a fact of life, and this has been abundantly underlined by the gentleman who spoke before me this morning. It is there. It is a reality. It's a fact of life. And this fact of life carries both benefits and costs. Or if we want to be a bit broader, we can call them advantages and drawbacks, which offers the advantage, by the way, of emphasizing that we're not only talking about material or financial benefits and costs, but also about symbolic benefits, but also symbolic costs. which is why not everybody is sold on the idea that multilingualism is great, and we also have to take these people on board. We also have, and you see me coming there, we also have to include them in a vision that emphasizes the importance of multilingualism and diversity. So how do we, it's a complex field, sometimes a complex minefield, I'm afraid. So this is why we need to be very cautious about how we balance mobility and inclusion, right? So the problem of managing linguistic diversity in all kinds of ways, you know, legal protections, education, promotion through the media, etc. We can recast this as a twin set of questions. The first one, actually, I have already mentioned. It's a question of pure balance, right? We have pros and cons, benefits and costs to mobility and inclusion, which are part and parcel of diversity. So what are the policies that can help democratic societies best balance mobility and inclusion, knowing that more of one typically means a bit less of the other? But then we can go one step further, and this is what we tried to do, in fact, in the MIME project very much. We can try to identify new policies that open up new possibilities. We can try to identify policies that can increase mobility without compromising inclusion, or improve inclusion without hampering mobility. Typically, trying to get more of each without having to sacrifice too much of the other. Well, or if you want to use another term, we can think in terms of increasing compatibility between mobility and inclusion in the management of diversity. Let me emphasize again that all these questions will arise in the context of very different issues, legal, educational, economic, etc., which are usually studied from the perspective of different disciplines, which is why, because they appear all over, which is why we also had to combine these disciplines when trying to address those questions. Now, this notion of trade-off is a generic problem, and it turns up in very different guises in each specific real-world case. One thing that was pretty, we did, get some people in the European Commission or close to the European Commission were really concerned that we would not come up with, well, how should I call this, with excessively simple recommendations, and they kept emphasizing that they wanted things that were, practical, and practical means that you have to take into account the fact that each case is a special case. So we really try to emphasize this, and I think it is something that many of us here, in particular when we run programs or are involved in programs that cover many situations in many countries, what is a very good solution in one case isn't necessarily good in another case. Or what's a good solution in one place is not a good solution in another place. You want to adapt it. Or if it's good in one place at a given point in time, well, things change. And then at another point in time, even in the same place, what was the best possible thing to do no longer is, and we have to come up with something new. Which is also why the notion of a best practice is, I think, and this is one point that was central for us in that project, the notion of best practice may be a little bit of an illusion, right? We can certainly observe certain responses, certain programs, and how they've worked in various contexts, but what we can say, oh, this has worked there, and that has worked over there, but we can't necessarily that, okay, this is the way to do it, and this is best practice. So what we've been using is the concept of successful practice as something which is not necessarily applicable elsewhere automatically, but something that can provide pointers, guidelines, orientation, inspiration, etc. So this is the spirit in which we've developed some of our work. This part of the results of the project are presented in a book, and the book you can get the PDF for free. And there is on the UNESCO table out there I will put this book as a display copy, but there is also a little flyer that tells you how to download this for free. And this book contains 72, it addresses in 2 pages each, 72 language policy questions. Right? So these language policy questions are mainly, many of them are based on specific case studies in specific areas where we looked at what has been successful. And in other entries are more about very general questions, but the idea is that different people, different users can, by going through the 70, well, those they are interested in among the 72 questions we address, can each, we hope, find useful pointers that are applicable to the problems that they are dealing with or the challenges that they have to meet. So just by way of example, in item 5 or question 5 of this book called the Mime Vade Mecum, hence letters VM, by the way, we can, through using something which is known as normative political theory, which is also known as political philosophy, we've identified 4 main types of concerns in defining what does equity, what does equality, what does justice mean in the allocation of language rights. A nice examination of how this can orient policy choices. So not every community, not every country, not every case has the same priorities, but here we've tried to say, well, essentially there seems to be 4 fundamental ways that you can approach this question of equality. And then, of course, you can adapt it to whichever situations or challenges you are confronting. Another one has to do with the statistical correlation between multilingualism and creativity. So in this case, instead of working with political philosophers, we've worked with psychologists, and the psychologists have ways of measuring creativity, which we correlated with multilingualism. And this, by the way, interesting results, pretty novel ones, because everybody talks about the fact that, oh yeah, multilingualism makes us more creative. Well, sure, but how do we know and how much? In this case, we have figures. Another entry, again, by way of example, is about the importance of having multilingualism in higher education, not just in basic education, but also in higher education. That's just really important, and we discuss why. We also have things about, very mundane, practical things about multilingual packaging and labeling and safety instructions, right? So all kinds of things there, but I think what really matters, and we don't have the time anyway to go into all this, but I think what really matters is what I would call the meta-level results. The meta-level results are sort of more general, more, in a sense, more interpretive, because they provide us with an approach, or perhaps, if you want, a way of thinking about linguistic diversity and how to manage it. When I say approach here, what I mean is a general philosophy, or if you want, a paradigm, and a set of conceptual and methodological tools. And this notion of meta-level result leads me to return to the notion of inclusion. And that's one of the most delicate in the whole package, probably the most politically loaded of them all. Now, inclusion frequently remains undefined, or the definition is implicit or taken for granted. It's also rife with moral, sometimes even moralistic overtones. Even if we share them, what we have to remember is that many people do not, and we have to deal with those people as well in our everyday work, or as either, in politics, in academia, and on terrain work as well, right? The problem with the notion of inclusion is that very often it doesn't mean much more than the opposite of the opposite. It doesn't mean more than the opposite of exclusion. So inclusion is a good guy, exclusion is a bad guy, but then what do we exactly mean by inclusion and exclusion? So one thing that came out from our work is that there are 3 important features of inclusion which help us to give it more specific substance, and also bearing in mind the notion that not everybody agrees. Right? First of all, I think it's a logical need. There is something even beyond or before morals or ethics. There is a logical necessity about inclusion, and this is one thing that we can emphasize in discussions with people who do not necessarily share the same vision, the same ideology, the same moral priorities. Right? For inclusion to occur, there needs to be something to be included into, right? There needs to be, in particular, a society with its language or languages, culture or cultures. I think the minister was mentioning the 800 languages of Papua New Guinea, and I was exchanging a few words this morning with one of our colleagues present here from Cameroon, and we mentioned the 278 languages recorded in Cameroon, right? So this society, this language, this culture, this can be in the plural, right? But it needs to be there. The something to be included into only makes sense if this something is identifiable. Again, there must be something to be included into, otherwise, what does inclusion mean, right? The chief features of identification for this something include those languages and cultures, again, in the singular or the plural. But I think the first thing is that there is no diversity and therefore no possible inclusion without identifiable elements that make up this diversity. Right? Of course, identity can change. One rejoinder that we sometimes get when we say what I've just said is that, well, this is a bit too fixist or this is too traditional. No, of course not. What I've just said does not mean that identity is a fixed or unchangeable essence. It's just that linguistic and cultural features, those in which societies recognize themselves and can express themselves, they change. Of course they change, not least through mutual linguistic contact, but this contact must be additive and enriching, not subtractive and disempowering. So yes, contact is great, and cultures change, languages change, and they influence each other. Yes, of course they do, but there are very different ways in which the process of change can take place, right? So society's linguistic and cultural features may change, but the change must be gradual and must be non-disruptive. At least this is what we found looking at various facets of European experience. What I've seen in other parts of the world goes in the same direction. Now, second important point about the nature of inclusion is in connection with notions of safety and welcome. Right? The specificity or the uniqueness or the character of each place is important. It matters to the people who live there. Some great classic authors, I'm here thinking about the late Joshua Fishman, talked about it as well in his, when he thought, what is ethnicity? He said that ethnicity is defined by three features, one of them which he called the phenomenology. But essentially what he meant is that it is important for people. And it is this importance that we should bear in mind. It is the foundation of people's sense of place, and hence the basis of a sense of linguistic and cultural security. We were fortunate in the project to be able to work with people who work in cultural geography, and to think about what is place, what is the sense of place, and try to build this into our analysis. So this feeling of security, in turn, is a precondition for being able to welcome the other, the newcomers and the immigrants. You cannot welcome the other if you don't have a sense of security of the place, the space, linguistic, cultural as well, into which you are letting the other in and inviting him in. So relatedly, it means that inclusion, by definition, must be for everybody. Right? It's a social and political project that must be in the interest not just of the specific small groups, but also of society as a whole, including the big groups into which, very often, for simple demographic reasons, inclusion should take place. So it is important for majorities who to understand that linguistic diversity is something that they can benefit from as well. They stand to gain from it. Inclusion must be for everybody, including for the majorities, in order for them to get on board and be part of this project. I think many of the difficulties that we have encountered, and we are still encountering, even in democratic societies, at the ballot box, with the rise of xenophobic parties, has to do with the fact that not enough attention has been devoted to explaining to majorities that diversity is a project in their benefit as well. We should talk to them perhaps a little more, right? Now, talking about social cohesion, we found that cohesion was a term that kept coming back all the time, and we also found that there was a bit of confusion between inclusion and cohesion. Sometimes you find that one word sort of like slips in instead of the other, and it's not the same thing at all. Here I have to cut a long story a bit short, but essentially the main point is that society can and will demonstrate cohesion if we have this balanced co-presence of mobility, which enables people to move, to meet, to interact, to cooperate, and inclusion as characterized here, namely something that preserves or safeguards diversity, uniqueness, and people's sense of security. And social cohesion will emerge from this balanced co-presence. Social cohesion cannot be based just on this, just on that. And so it needs mobility and inclusion, but inclusion, I think, in the sense in which I've tried to characterize it. So we're drawing to a close. We're reaching paragraph 16 out of the 18, and I'm only doing 17 because 18, as you may have seen, is only a list of resources. Let's try and step back just a little bit and think about diversity in a more general way. Diversity isn't simply a blend or a mix. Diversity requires distinct and interrelated elements, and these elements, of course, even if they remain distinct, they interact, and even new elements may emerge. And we found interesting parallels, which we are currently now, post-project, only beginning to explore. We revisit in depth some interesting parallels with the science of ecology, or if you want, environmental studies, where they're quite clear that diversity only makes sense if you have distinct elements. And they reason in terms of species, different species who live in specific habitats, and the world itself is made up of a great variety of habitats. But not all species are present in each habitat, but together they all form one world. And I think this observation carries over to the management of linguistic diversity. So what brings us together here. This notion of linguistic diversity also needs identifiable elements, not species, but languages, in various habitats. Various habitats are various parts of the world, some big, some small, who are diverse in themselves, but do not necessarily have the same type of diversity. I'm delighted as a native speaker of French to be in surroundings where I hardly hear any French, and I hear different things. I hear Thai, first of all, when I walk in the street, which I did last night. But it is a different habitat. And this is the whole point. The diversity in my hometown, which is very diverse because it has lots of immigration, lots of international expats. The type of habitat that we have in Geneva is diverse. The type of habitat that we have in Bangkok is diverse. But the diversity is not just between the languages, or if you want the species, the diversity is also between the habitats, which are different from one another. And for a living diversity, we need the diversity of species as well as the diversity of habitats. So this is why the locales must remain different. Now, this has various implications for research, and I will conclude with this. I think it is important to think in terms of selecting and using relevant concepts when thinking about diversity. We hear nowadays in contemporary research about multilingualism, language education, etc. We hear all kinds of claims suggesting that, well, languages do not exist and that mother tongue is a concept that we should forget. I'm thinking about one author, I can't remember exactly whom, who says that mother tongue, quote unquote, is a concept that has no place in the sociolinguist's toolkit. Well, I beg to differ. I think it is a very important concept, quite the opposite. I think we need to think in terms of named languages. Some of my colleagues berate the notion of named languages as too narrow, too fixist, too essentialist. Well, again, I beg to differ. Yes, of course, languages are porous. And we do exploit every day when we speak, we exploit these connections between languages. We exploit these connections between the languages that we speak within our repertoires, right? But most real-life actors, most people, most of us really, we experience languages in our repertoires as distinct. And when we communicate, they are distinct. If someone was to ask me a question in Thai, I'm afraid I would be completely lost. If I were to answer in French a question that I can understand, the French would be accessible to some, but it would be lost for others. So we do, even if languages are porous, obviously they are distinct languages, and obviously it makes sense to keep referring to named languages. Likewise, mother tongue. Lots of people claim that mother tongue is not a relevant concept. And I can definitely agree with the idea that mother tongue means very different things to different people. But still, I think it is meaningful. We may have more than one mother tongue, obviously, but still the notion of a mother tongue as opposed to languages that we acquire later in life for other reasons, in other contexts, in early childhood, this is obviously relevant. And survey after survey, and I've done a few, some small with a few hundred, and some large, with about, well over 40,000 people. Survey after survey after survey, even if we give people the possibility to indicate several mother tongues, they always indicate one or two, but the concept of mother tongue itself remains relevant to all our respondents, well over 90%. And then 90% is really the lowest figure. It's usually more than this, right? So this is why we need to keep working with those, I think, relevant, traditional, common sense notions of languages, named languages, identified languages. Again, diversity needs identifiable elements. And we also need to think in terms of something called mother tongue. And conversely, I think we should treat some faddish notions with a bit of caution. This is linked to democracy, because without terms and concepts like named languages, like mother tongue, etc., I think we'd be depriving ourselves of the terms that we need to think about diversity. We'd be depriving speakers of threatened languages of the concept that they need to protect and promote their languages, and would be undermining linguistic diversity itself. And now my concluding slide, because I see that my time is up. I'd like to mention Albert Camus, French novelist. Some of you might have come across some of his work. And 75 years ago, he said that mal nommer les choses, c'est ajouter au malheur du monde. Misnaming things adds to the misfortunes of the world. And I think this applies to linguistic diversity as well. I think we need to use sound concepts because that's a condition for ensuring a just, sustainable, and multilingualism in a multipolar world. So thank you very much. Kopkum Ka. Merci.
Thank you very much, Professor Grin, for that great opening keynote address. I'm going to go straight to the audience. We are encroaching potentially on coffee time, so let's go to the audience. And are there any questions that anyone would like to ask? You can see a couple of microphones, so please jump up and run to the microphone or wave your hand and I will ask someone to come to you. But while we wait for you to kind of collect your thoughts, we do have one question. Yes, great. There's a gentleman over here to my left. Could someone get him a microphone, please? Thank you very much, sir, for being the brave first questioner of the morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the speaker. I enjoyed your talk. I'm Gracien